Hey everybody, today's episode I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to list my top 3 most influential authors for me personally. Not all of these are going to be the most influential authors of all time. I don't have Tolkien on here, but these 3 authors that I'm going to talk about are the most important, first as a child, then as a teenager, and now as an adult. The first author that influenced my fantasy reading is Brian Jaques. That might sound a little funny to some of you. It sounded funny to me until just very recently. I always called him either Brian Jaques or Brian Jaques. But I recently listened to an interview he did where he actually talks about his name, and it is Brian Jaques. And he said Americans almost always call him Brian Jaques. So I guess I've called him the wrong name as a stereotypical American for most of my life. He wrote the Redwall books. The Redwall books were the first fantasy series that I ever read. There are 21 of them. The first one was published in 1986. The last one in 2011, right around the time that he died. I once watched an interview that Jaques did where he talked about why he wrote books the way he wrote them. His books would be like 300 to 400 pages long. I loved them as a kid. He felt like children needed real meaty books. They didn't need picture books, or they didn't need something that was really dumbed down. I started reading. I don't actually remember when I learned to read, but my mom told me by the time I was 4 I could read. When I was about 7 or 8 when I started reading these books. I remember vividly around 9 years old reading one of the books, the first one where Martin the Warrior wasn't involved anymore. And it was something that was a little bit devastating to me. They were talking about in the Redwall Abbey, about his tomb and his sword up on the weather vane. And I just remember feeling like just such a sense of sadness. And I think it might have been one of the first times that I kind of really realized that eventually we'll all die, and and the people moving on after us will only have memories of us. That might sound a little bit macabre for a 9-year-old to be thinking about, but I really loved those books from, maybe the age of 6 or 7 all the way up till about 12 years old. Then I had a couple years where I didn't read as much. I played a lot of sports. And this is where the second author comes into play. I was sitting in an English class, as I've already mentioned previously, just goofing off because we didn't have any AP classes at the time. I was a sophomore. I was about 14 years old. And my English teacher put a book in my hands after I was doing just too much talking one day and told me to read it. That book was the first book in the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. So Robert Jordan is the second of the most influential authors in my reading history. What I'm going to say about the Wheel of Time series is it's what probably made me a nerd. It's what took me past just loving those Redwall books and those anthropomorphic animals into actually being a real fan of a series. It also gave me the name for my first podcast and now show. The Nerd Book Review is directly related to my dad. I was growing up, I'd be sitting in my room reading one of these Wheel of Time books, and my dad would come into my room and say, "Hey, quit reading those nerd books and get outside and go play." My dad was he was a generally decent dad, but he's also your stereotypical, even to this day in his 60s, he considers a real solid day going fishing and getting drunk. So, a little bit different there, not to bash my dad, but he is real proud of the fact that he has not read a book as an adult. He thinks you should be out there doing things, right? So, kind of as a little bit of a shot to him and as a joke among my friends, because I'm actually really lucky that some of my friends from the time I was like 9, 10 years old are still regular friends of mine in my 40s. And so it's been a joke for a good solid 30 years among some of us and then my wife for the last 10 years. So I named the podcast first, and now the show, the Nerd Book Review, kind of as a jab against him. He does think it's funny. But getting back on track, when I was a teenager, this is when, like I said, I really kind of started to identify as a nerd. I got really into the Wheel of Time books. At this stage, I've now read them more than a half a dozen times, and in the last 5 years, I've listened to them on audiobook 3 times. It just provides me such a sense of nostalgia to listen on audiobook now. But this is where I really got into a fandom. Back in my high school days, in the late 90s, I started getting into like Dragon Mount. It was the first time the internet forums, right? I still swear to this day that Jordan changed Mazrim Time from being Demandrid because we were all talking about it in the Dragon Mount forums. And he thought like there was a little bit too choreographed there, that we all knew it. And so he was going to have to change it. I loved how in interviews later on he would sometimes say, yeah, those guys did occasionally figure something out that I didn't want them to figure out. I don't know if he ever admitted that he changed things because of it, but that's where, to this very day, I just love everything about Wheel of Time. I have all the companion books, the thesaurus. I've read through all of them multiple times. Any other book that I've done that since is a direct correlation between, me getting into that Wheel of Time fandom. The third author, and this is the author that has most influenced me as an adult, is Mark Lawrence. He has several series. He's even got some sci-fi stuff that I will admit that I have not read yet. I'm not a huge sci-fi guy as a general rule. I will read some of it. But his Broken Empire trilogy, as well as the Red Queen's War, set in the same world, they really got me into grimdark in the first place. Jorg is just a genocidal asshole, but I loved reading about him, and it was just such a difference, right, between having your hero who is the noble character, right? Even if he's just the farm boy, he's always the good guy. Well, Jorg's not the good guy, even if he is the protagonist, right? That changed a whole lot about my reading. I first read him, and then I read like The Black Company, and then I read Malazan and a bunch of other stuff. I probably had a good 5-6 year run where almost everything I read was grimdark just because of getting into Mark Lawrence. But the second most important thing, actually maybe even the most important thing that Mark Lawrence did as far as influencing my reading, is that he created the Spiffbo competition, the SPFBO, as both he and most of the bloggers who are running the competition and rating the books, they always call it SPFBO, but for me it just sounds better to say Spiffbo. So anyways, he started that competition. That is a competition that if you've ever watched my episodes before or listened to my podcast, you're going to know. It is 300 indie fantasy authors. They cannot have a publisher for the book they enter. There are 10 different blogs. They will each get 30 books. They'll whittle them down first to semifinalists, and then they'll whittle it down to a finalist. The final 10 books will be judged by all 10 of the blogs, and a winner will be announced. This competition has been huge for an awful lot of fantasy authors. You've got people like Jonathan French, Justin Lee Anderson, Josiah Bancroft. All of those authors now have publishing deals in large part because of the SPFBO, Spiffbo competition. Every year, I like to do all 10 of the finalists. I did it back when I had my podcast, and now I'm going to go back and I've got 6 of the 10 read and 5 of the episodes recorded now. I really love the competition. I feel like it has really helped bring indie authors to the fore. I like grimdark, and I feel like the indie authors were largely where the real cutting edge grimdark books were for a long period of time. I also enjoy character driven world building books, and I feel like sometimes those slower books don't get picked up by a big publisher because they don't have enough action, or there's just something unusual or different about them that I personally really like. And I think that in some cases it's helped authors actually become more independent and be able to be full-time writers because of that. So Mark Lawrence, both his series, which I love, as well as what he did with the Spiffbo competition, have been very influential for me. A third thing with Mark Lawrence is that he is kind of almost, his books are a big reason why I started the podcast in the first place. I got my wife to read the Broken Empire books. She didn't love Jorg, which is probably pretty understandable since he is a genocidal maniac with a bunch of rapists as his main band. But then she's walking by as I am recording this currently and says she only made it like halfway through the first book. So as I'm recording this, my wife just walked by and said she only read the first half of the first Broken Empire book. But I read those, then I read The Red Queen's War, and I loved them as well. And then the Books of the Ancestor came out, and I read that first one, and I thought, finally, here's a book she's going to love by Mark Lawrence. She absolutely loved those books. So once I got her to read those books, and then we talked about those a bunch. I think that maybe she jokingly said several times I should start a podcast because I always like to talk about my books. But we, as a couple, even though we were both reading fantasy, we didn't discuss the books all that much. So we made the podcast, and our first episode, of course, was the first book, Prince of Thorns in the Broken Empire series. And it was fun, getting to talk about it, how she really didn't like the book. I liked it. I felt like it was a good opening episode for us. We also did Red Sister at one point, if you want to go back and look at that episode of our podcast. So Mark Lawrence has had just such an incredible influence on me, both with his books, my love of grimdark, and then with the Spiffbo competition, as well as getting me into the indie, and then also inspiring us to start the podcast in the first place. And once again, the three authors are Brian Jaques, who is the most influential author of my childhood for me. His fantasy books were just amazing as YA, maybe some of the original YA, right? The children's books that were several hundred pages long, dealt with adult concepts in a way that children could deal with. Going back as an adult, obviously, there are some problematic elements where, the mice, the badgers, and there are always the good races, right? If you are a rat or a weasel or something like that, then you're going to be evil. There aren't good rats or good stoats or weasels. So that's a little bit problematic probably in this day and age. But as a kid, I absolutely just loved them. It gave me those adult concepts. Then getting into teenage years, Robert Jordan, The Wheel of Time, was what made me truly the nerd that I am today. I just loved those books. It really was the first magic system books that I got into reading. And it just has made a difference for my entire life as an adult and how I've read and liking magic. Then Mark Lawrence is the most influential author for me as an adult. As I mentioned, the SPFBO competition, Grimdark, and I don't think I actually mentioned this, but also his writing style is really awesome, where he gets as much stuff in like 300 to 400 pages as Robert Jordan took 900 pages to do. There's no chairs described in detail in a room that no one will even enter, much less sit in, like there are in Robert Jordan's books when Mark Lawrence is writing. I would love it if you would tell me who your most influential authors are in your own reading life, whether they're your favorites or not. Maybe someone like Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or even George R.R. Martin might be more influential to a larger number of people, but those three authors are the most influential to me as a reader.